Wow. Excellent. Really liked Gardens of the Moon. I'm excited to start the next one and see what my favorite characters are up to. Wait a minute. It's a different continent? Hello, thanks for joining me for this spoiler-free review of Deadhouse Gates, the second book in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. Hopefully you weren't too attached to Ganabakis, where the first book was, because now we are in 7 cities, a totally different continent. The plot of Deadhouse Gates basically boils down to rebellion. The Malazan Empire has taken over 7 cities several years ago, obviously in sort of this state of peace that is somewhat tenuous because a rebellion starts around something called the Whirlwind, which is in this secluded part of the desert that is hard to get to, called Raraku, and there is a prophetess there called Shaik who's apparently going to start this big rebellion. We start out before this rebellion, although there are whispers of it throughout the continent, and eventually chaos ensues everywhere. And after all the craziness of the rebellion starts, we are, as the reader, getting little information about what exactly is happening because we're basically going to boil down to 3 main storylines. The first is going to be with some of the characters we know from the first book in the series, Gardens of the Moon. If you remember, at the end of Gardens of the Moon, Kalam and Fiddler are going to go with Crocus and Apsalar to try to return Apsalar to her home, where she was abducted by Cotillion the Rope so many years ago. On their way back to Apsalar's village, they happen to be in 7 cities at the wrong time when this whole Whirlwind Rebellion happens. So this is a really good anchor point for us because we know these characters, we want them to be safe, and they're just kind of stuck in this rebellion without any particular role to play. They're just trying to get through it alive. The second viewpoint is with new characters, Felicin, Bodin, and Heboric. The basic idea of those 3 are that they are fugitives running away from the Malazan Empire. Each of them were enslaved and imprisoned because of various deeds. Felicin, our connection to her is that she is the younger sister of Ganos Perrin from the first one. So we don't see any of Perrin the captain, but Felicin, his younger sister. We follow them through 7 cities. Again, those 2 groups are just trying to kind of survive. The third viewpoint is much more actively involved in the rebellion that is taking place. It's from the perspective of the Malazans that have survived the initial rebellion rise up, because that kills a lot of the Malazan forces, and that is what gets called eventually the Chain of Dogs. And we follow 2 primary perspectives there. Coltane, who is the main sort of military leader, and then Druiker, who's actually an imperial historian who is there, although he was an ex-soldier and is able to fight, he's primarily there to observe so that the history of the armies can be told. Let's get into some of the strengths of Deadhouse Gates. First of all, I love this new setting. I think 7 cities is an incredibly interesting place, and it really opens up the world of Malazan Book of the Fallen so much wider. The guts to start the second book off in a 10-series epic in a completely different continent is amazing. You're, again, learning new cities, new area, and it just makes the world feel incredibly massive. And the setting itself I actually really, really like. It's completely different from Ganabakis, where we were before. It's arid, it's more of a desert, and you really get the sense that this is a hard place to live. It actually reminded me if, like, during Shark Week or like during Swamp Week on Discovery Channel, you suddenly notice that a lot of these terrible animals that could kill you all live in Australia. That's kind of what 7 Cities reminded me of. It's just a lot of terrible stuff, really hard to survive, and the land really is actively trying to kill you. It also sort of reminded me of a lot of space adventures, or movies particularly, where like things keep going wrong and space is actively trying to kill you. Same idea with 7 Cities. All of our heroes, from this huge army to just these small groups of people, are just constantly coming under attack, whether it's rebels, whether it's the actual natural elements, the weird magical elements that are everywhere. Seven Cities is a hard place to live and an even harder place to thrive. Another strength of Deadhouse Gates is the returning characters. Fiddler and Kalam start to become more fleshed out characters. In the first book, they really were just kind of part of the Bridgebirders. They had something that you could recognize as individual characteristics, but in this one, very particularly, you start to really know them and love them as characters. The same is true for Crocus and Apsalar. Obviously, for most of Gardens of the Moon, Apsalar is someone totally different, Sari, and so we're really learning about this new person, but there's still aspects of Sari. She's even starting to get to know herself, so it's a really interesting viewpoint to take. Crocus is maturing rapidly, and again, part of that is that he's in Seven Cities and in this terrible situation, so he has to start becoming more and more of his own person and survive on his own and make wiser decisions. But it's also a little sad to read his perspective because he's losing sort of that youthful enthusiasm that we liked about him from Gardens of the Moon. So these new returning characters really give us a place to really like anchor down in the story while a bunch of crazy new stuff is happening, which is really helpful. Another great strength of this book is that the new characters are all really, really strong. Standouts, especially in my opinion, are Felicin, Heboric, and then Druiker. I think those three are really like interesting perspectives. They really add a lot to the story, and they're not just redos of other perspectives we've seen in the series. They're really totally new. Another strength of Deadhouse Gates, I think, is the perspectives that we're put in. Obviously, the idea of rebellion against a larger empire is a device that is used a lot in fiction generally, not just in fantasy. But usually you're at one of the perspectives, right? You're either for the rebels going against the empire, or you're from the perspective of the empire who is defending against like the barbarians or rebels that are coming in to take over the kingdom. But in Deadhouse Gates, you're not really going in either of those perspectives. Usually you're just in a perspective of someone who's trying to survive the rebellion. So actually for a large swath of the book, you don't really know what is happening with the rebellion. You're either with the chain of dogs who are just trying to survive and run away from the rebellion forces, or you're with like individuals who are, again, just trying to survive at a much even smaller aspect than the chain of dogs. You're not really placed in the action, and for most of the time you don't know what's happening with the rebellion, and even through the whole book you don't really know exactly what the plan is. You just know that these characters that you're following, you like them and you want them to survive. Not just one, but two of the main perspectives in this book are either historians who are actively being historians or people who were historians. Erikson is very purposefully doing that to, I think, hammer in the point of this novel. I think this novel is a anti-war fantasy novel, something that is sadly too rare in our genre. It's against ambition, it's against vainglory, and it is against violence. And that's going to move me to some of the weaknesses of the book. This isn't necessarily a weakness, but it absolutely needs to be said while talking about Deadhouse Gates. Massive trigger warning for some terrible things that are going to happen in this novel. There's rape, there's sexual assault, violence against animals, gruesome warfare. It's a really tough book to read. Now, I will say in its defense that this book doesn't do any of that for like action purposes or portray any of it as good or show you things explicitly just to be explicit. It's a pet peeve of mine, especially in fantasy, is showing things like rape just to sort of like establish bad characters. I think that's gross, or can be done in a really gross way. That's not how it's presented in this book. It's rough, but again, all of that is lent towards the overall force of the book being an anti-war, anti-violence novel. Another potential weakness of Deadhouse Gates is that while the prose are better than they are in Gardens of the Moon and a little bit more readable, they're not quite to the heights that I think the Malazan series as a whole will reach. I think Memories of Ice is really where Erikson is going to hit his stride. So it's a little more readable than Gardens of the Moon, but there are parts where you feel lost, where the prose are very dense. So just prepare for that. Again, especially at the beginning, as you're kind of getting into the flow of the story, you could have some rough episodes where you're having trouble getting through chapters. But as usual in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, if you push through, you're really going to be rewarded for that effort. The Mappo and Ikariam storyline, I think as characters are kind of interesting, but there are times where that storyline really drags and you'd really just rather be elsewhere in the story, but you're stuck with Ikariam and Mappo. Another potential weakness of Deadhouse Gates is the amount of battles that are described in it. I actually really enjoy this. I like to know sort of the specific movements and strategy of the commanders in these big battles, and Erikson does this very well, especially in a book that is all about war. I think that's necessary to do, but it is done a lot. So if that's something that you're not really into in a fantasy novel, just know that there are going to be a lot of those military aspects in play. Necessary again, but if that's not your thing, just know there are going to be a lot of battles in Deadhouse Gates, a whole lot more than there were in Gardens of the Moon. In conclusion, I think Deadhouse Gates is a great book. It's definitely a change of pace in the Malazan series. If you really like Gardens of the Moon, be prepared to kind of be thrown off, but Malazan does that a lot to you. As you're reading it, it's going to change and feel different, but still very good. I think that shows an incredible authorial command of the world and the story that he's telling. Erikson really shows that off, I think, in Deadhouse Gates. The new setting is really great. It's different. All the basic aspects of the novel are very good. I think what really propels Deadhouse Gates to, again, really push the series is, like I have said multiple times at this point, how it is very clearly a treatise against violence, a treatise against war, and really reflecting on the vainglory and ambition that commanders particularly have in war, or I should say the aggressors in war. This next part might be me reading a little too much into a quote that's at the very beginning of the book. Don't worry, it's not a spoiler. It's literally the first thing in the prologue, but I think it really sets up the purpose and thrust and theme of the novel as a whole. It's actually a quote from a character we've met before in Gardens of the Moon, Tok the Younger, and this is the quote in the prologue. "What see you in the horizon's bruised smear that cannot be blotted out by your raised hand?" And I think Erikson is pointing out in this book that the instigators of war often are not paying attention to the lessons of history, both behind them and in front of them. So the quote's about the horizon, right? And we always have a horizon behind us and in front of us. And oftentimes, the behind can tell us what is going to happen in front. And so history, if you look behind and really look at that horizon, can help you see what is happening ahead of you. So in war, we can see from history the devastation and the futility of it, and yet the awfulness of the consequences. And so we can suspect that what we do in the future is going to have those same repercussions. Unfortunately, as Tok says, you can blot out the horizon with a single hand. And oftentimes those with ambitions do just that, thinking that, oh, it'll be different for me. This whole whirlwind episode is just this explosion of violence, almost for violence sake, or tearing something good, like a good cause, and using it for evil by various people. And so I really think Deadhouse Gates is a strong treatise against war, against violence. Alright, can't say much more or I'm going to start giving away spoilers, but I definitely recommend Deadhouse Gates. It's a really great book, and I think a step up from Gardens of the Moon. I'm going to give it a total score of 8 out of 10. Thank you so much for watching this spoiler-free review of Deadhouse Gates, second book in the Malazan Book of the Fallen. Please be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Also in the comments below, let me know what you think of Deadhouse Gates. No spoilers, please. First in, last out.